The smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air as James Parker, a proud veteran, stepped into a small-town diner, hoping for a warm meal after a long drive. Wearing his military cap, a symbol of his years of service, he expected the same respect he had always shown others. But the moment he walked in, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations quieted, eyes lingered a little too long, and the waitress hesitated before approaching his table. James had faced challenges before, both on the battlefield and back home, but nothing prepared him for what happened next. As he placed his order, he noticed the subtle glances, the whispered words, the coldness in the air. And then, just as his food was being prepared, something happened that made it clear he wasn't welcome there. Most people would have walked out, maybe argued, maybe even caused a scene. But James, he chose a different path, one that no one in that diner expected. What he did next wasn't just about standing up for himself, it was about proving that dignity and kindness are more powerful than hate. Stay with us as we take you through this incredible true story, one that will challenge how we see each other and remind us of the power of grace in the face of discrimination. What did James do? How did the people in the diner react? You won't want to miss what happens next. James sat quietly at his table, his hands resting on the worn wooden surface. He had been in situations before where he felt unwelcome, but something about this moment felt different. The waitress, a young woman who looked no older than 20, finally approached with a hesitant smile. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, her voice polite but uneasy. James nodded. "Just coffee, please." As she walked away, he could still feel the weight of the stares from across the room. A group of men at the counter muttered to each other, their eyes flicking toward him. An older couple near the window exchanged looks but said nothing. It wasn't just one person, it was the entire room, silently deciding whether he belonged. James had spent years serving his country, fighting for the very freedoms that allowed each person in that diner to live their lives without fear. Yet, here he was, being treated as if he were the problem. His uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, but his sense of duty remained. He knew that how he responded in this moment mattered. The waitress returned, placing the cup of coffee in front of him with a shaky hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered under her breath, so quietly that James almost missed it. He looked up at her, but before he could say anything, a voice from the counter called out, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "What's a man like you doing in a place like this?" The diner went silent. The voice belonged to a man sitting at the counter, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. James lifted his coffee cup, taking a slow sip before setting it down carefully. He had learned long ago that his reaction in moments like this mattered more than the words thrown his way. "I'm here for the same reason as anyone else," James said calmly, his deep voice steady. "A good meal and a little rest." A few customers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to hear the exchange, others watching closely. The waitress stood frozen for a moment before quickly stepping away, as if wanting no part in whatever was about to unfold. The man at the counter smirked and shook his head. "Didn't expect to see someone like you here, that's all." His words carried weight, unspoken meaning hanging between them. James studied him for a moment. The man wasn't young, probably in his 50s, with a kind of weathered face that suggested a hard life. But there was something else, something beyond the hostility. Was it fear? Resentment? James had encountered both before, sometimes from people who had never met someone like him, never understood his journey. A low murmur spread across the room. The tension thickened, pressing in from all sides. James could feel the weight of judgment, of expectation. He could have responded with anger. He could have walked out, but instead, he took a deep breath and did something no one expected. James set his coffee cup down gently, his fingers steady despite the tension in the room. He locked eyes with the man at the counter, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something stronger, unshaken confidence. The man seemed surprised, as if expecting a different reaction. "You ever serve?" James asked, his tone even. The question caught the man off guard. He shifted in his seat, glancing down for a brief moment before looking back up. "Korea," the man muttered. "A long time ago." James nodded, as if that answer told him everything he needed to know. He recognized a stiffness in the man's posture, the way his fingers curled slightly on the counter, as if holding something invisible from the past. He had seen it before, the weight of old battles that never quite left a soldier, no matter how many years passed. "I was in Vietnam," James said. "Long time ago, too." The diner remained quiet, but the energy in the room shifted. Some of the customers who had been watching closely exchanged glances, sensing something unexpected unfolding. The waitress hovered near the kitchen, her hands nervously twisting the edge of her apron. The man at the counter exhaled sharply, his smirk fading. He studied James, really looking at him this time, as if seeing him for the first time. But before he could speak, the door to the diner swung open, and a new presence entered, one that changed everything. The door swung open with a sharp creak, letting in a gust of cold air. Every head in the diner turned. A younger man stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. His jacket was worn, his face tense. But it wasn't just his sudden entrance that caught everyone's attention. It was the way his eyes locked onto James the moment he stepped through the door. The man at the counter shifted, his body going rigid. The younger man ignored him, his focus locked on James as he took slow, deliberate steps toward his table. James straightened, sensing something deeper than just curiosity. The young man's expression wasn't hostile, but there was something unresolved in his eyes. "You're James Parker, right?" His voice was firm, carrying an urgency that sent a ripple through the room. James gave a slow nod, measuring his words. "I am." The man inhaled sharply, his fingers twitching at his sides. "My grandfather served with you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "He used to tell me stories about you." James narrowed his eyes, trying to place the name, the face. But before he could ask, the man continued, his words coming faster now. "He said you saved his life." The tension in the diner shifted, confusion replacing the unease. The older man at the counter turned sharply toward the young man, his expression unreadable. James could feel the weight of a new revelation pressing in. But then, just as suddenly as the moment had begun, something changed. The young man's face darkened, and his voice dropped lower. "He also said you disappeared when he needed you most." The room felt even smaller now, the weight of the young man's words pressing down on everyone inside. James held his gaze, searching for the right response. He had been prepared for cold stares, even for hostility, but this was something different. This was personal. "I disappeared," James repeated, his voice measured. He didn't recognize the young man, but the accusation cut deep. The younger man's jaw tightened. "My grandfather, William Carter," he said, the name hitting James like a punch to the chest. "He said you saved him once, but when he needed you again, you were gone." James inhaled sharply. He hadn't heard that name in decades. William Carter, Billy, they had fought together, bled together, survived things most men never spoke about, and James had never forgotten. "I never left him," James said, his voice firm but filled with something heavier, regret. "I was taken." A murmur rippled through the diner. The older man at the counter turned fully now, staring at James with an unreadable expression. The young man frowned, confused. James set his coffee cup down, his hands steady. "Billy and I were caught in an ambush," he continued. "I got him to safety, but I was captured before I could make it back. I spent months in a prison camp before I made it home." The younger man's face shifted, the anger giving way to something else. Understanding, maybe even guilt. "He thought you abandoned him," he admitted quietly. "He never knew." James nodded slowly. "I tried to find him when I got back, but by then he had disappeared too." The older man at the counter let out a shaky breath. "Billy Carter was my brother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought you were the reason he never came home." James looked at him, really looked at him. The pieces were falling into place, the years of misunderstanding and misplaced blame finally unraveling. The young man swallowed hard. He carried that weight within his whole life, he said. If he had known the truth, his voice trailed off. James sat back, exhaling slowly. He had spent so many years wondering what had happened to Billy, carrying his own burden of guilt. Now, sitting in a diner filled with strangers, he realized that sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought on a battlefield. They were fought in the quiet spaces of memory, in the things left unsaid. For the first time since walking in, the tension in the diner shifted, not with hostility, but with something else. Understanding. James lifted his coffee cup once more, raising it slightly in silent tribute. The older man hesitated, then did the same. The past couldn't be changed, but in that moment, something long overdue had finally been set right. The diner, once filled with tension and quiet judgment, now held a different kind of silence. It wasn't the kind that made a man feel unwelcome. It was the kind that came when something heavy had finally lifted. James let out a slow breath, setting down his cup as the weight of years of misunderstanding settled into something more manageable. The young man, still standing near his table, seemed different now. Less angry, less certain of the story he had carried with him all these years. "I wish my grandfather could have heard this," he said, his voice softer now. He spent so long believing something that wasn't true. James gave a small nod. "We all carry things we don't have answers for," he said, "but sometimes the truth finds its way through." The older man at the counter, Billy's brother, sighed and reached for his own cup, gripping it as if steadying himself. "Guess I misjudged you," he admitted, his voice gruff. "I see that now." James didn't need an apology. Some things were better understood through actions than words. Instead, he simply nodded, accepting the moment for what it was. The waitress, who had watched everything unfold, finally stepped forward. "Would you like anything else?" she asked, her voice warmer now. James smiled, glancing around the room before shaking his head. "No, ma'am," he said, standing up. "I think I got what I came for." With that, he left the diner, not with anger, not with regret, but with something far more valuable: peace.